I never imagined that saying "I do" would cost me my mother's love. For 30 years, she built a fortress of tradition around our family, brick by careful brick, convinced that only one kind of woman could keep it standing. Then I fell in love with someone who was born on the other side of that wall, a woman who tried, again and again, to prove she belonged inside it. What followed wasn't shouting. It wasn't slammed doors. It was quieter than that, and somehow crueler. Silent dinners. Careful cruelty disguised as concern. A grandmother who could sing lullabies to my daughter in the next room, yet barely look her mother in the eye. I kept telling my wife it would get better. I kept telling myself the same thing. I was wrong for longer than I want to admit. This is the story of the two women I loved most in the world. Standing on opposite sides of a line my mother drew before either of them ever spoke a word to each other. And what it finally took to bring that line down. My name is Rohan Bhatia, and I am 37 years old. I have lived in the United States since I was 8, when my parents left Jaipur behind with 2 suitcases and a folder of documents that represented every hope they had for the future. I do not remember much about the flight itself, but I remember my mother's hand gripping mine so tightly in the airport that my fingers went numb. I remember thinking that she was scared, though she never would have admitted it. My mother, Savitri Bhatia, was never a woman who admitted fear. She converted it into determination instead, and that determination shaped almost every year of my childhood. We settled in a small town outside Chicago, in a modest 2-bedroom apartment above a dry cleaning shop. My father, Vikram Bhatia, took a job as an accountant for a firm that barely acknowledged his qualifications from India, and he worked twice as hard to prove himself worthy of a title he already deserved. My mother stayed home in those early years, but staying home for her never meant resting. She built a small universe inside our apartment, one filled with the smell of cumin and turmeric, the sound of Lata Mangeshkar songs playing from a cassette player, and shelves lined with brass idols she had wrapped in newspaper and carried across an ocean. She used to tell me, when I was young, that we were guests in America, and that guests must never forget where they came from. I did not understand the weight of that sentence then. I only understood that Diwali meant lights and sweets, that Sunday mornings meant temple visits with the small Indian community that had slowly formed around us, and that speaking Hindi at home was not optional. It was expected, the way breathing is expected. As I grew older, America became less like a foreign country, and more like the only country I truly knew. I made friends at school who could not pronounce my name correctly, and eventually I stopped correcting them. I played basketball in the driveway with neighborhood boys named Tyler and Marcus. I learned to love hot dogs at baseball games as much as I loved my mother's chole bhature. By the time I reached high school, I existed in 2 worlds that rarely touched each other, and I became skilled at moving between them without ever fully belonging to either. My mother noticed this shift, and it worried her more than she let on. She began speaking more often about the daughters of her friends from the temple community, mentioning their names during dinner, as though she were reading a grocery list. "Priya is studying to become a doctor," she would say, passing me the rice. "Her mother tells me she is very traditional, very respectful." I would nod and change the subject, assuming these comments were simply my mother's way of staying connected to the community she had built with her own hands. Brick by brick, prayer by prayer. I met Emily Carter when I was 32 years old, at a marketing firm in downtown Chicago where we both worked. She was a project coordinator with an easy laugh and a habit of asking real questions, instead of the polite, hollow ones most people ask when they first meet someone. During a team lunch, she asked me about the small pendant I wore around my neck, a tiny Ganesha my mother had given me before I left for college. I explained what it meant, expecting her interest to fade the way it usually did with people who asked out of courtesy rather than curiosity. Instead, she asked 3 more questions, and then a 4th. Over the following months, what began as friendly conversations in the break room turned into lunches, and then dinners, and then long phone calls that stretched past midnight. Emily was unlike anyone I had dated before, not because she was American, but because she never once tried to minimize the parts of me that came from Jaipur. She wanted to understand them. When I told her about my family for the first time, really told her, including how central our traditions were to my mother's sense of identity, Emily did not flinch. She asked if she could come to a Diwali celebration sometime, just to watch, just to learn. I brought her to my parents' house for the first time on a Sunday afternoon in October, 3 years after we started dating. I remember standing outside the front door with her, feeling my heart pound in a way it never had during job interviews or difficult presentations. Emily squeezed my hand and told me she was nervous too, but excited. She had worn a soft blue kurti she had bought specifically for the occasion, and she had practiced saying "Namaste, Auntie" to my mother for nearly a week beforehand. My mother opened the door, looked at Emily for a long moment, and then smiled the kind of smile that does not quite reach the eyes. "Come in," she said in English, though she rarely spoke English inside our home. I understood, even then, that this small linguistic choice was not accidental. It was a wall being built, quietly, politely, before either of us had said another word. The afternoon went well enough on the surface. Emily complimented my mother's cooking sincerely, asked about the significance of the diyas lined along the windowsill, and listened attentively when my father explained, in his usual gentle way, the story of Rama's return to Ayodhya. My mother answered every question Emily asked, but her answers were short, functional, missing the warmth she usually poured into these stories when she told them to me as a child. Later that night, after we left, Emily told me she thought the visit had gone beautifully. I did not have the heart to tell her what I already suspected, sitting quietly beside her in the car, watching the streetlights pass over her hopeful face. I suspected that my mother had already made up her mind about her, long before Emily ever walked through that door. The months following that first meeting settled into an uneasy rhythm. Emily and I visited my parents every few weeks, and each visit followed a similar pattern. My mother would be polite, correct, even generous with her cooking, sending Emily home with containers of food she had prepared with obvious care. But beneath the surface courtesy, something colder persisted, something Emily began to notice even though she rarely spoke of it directly. "Your mother called me that girl again today," Emily mentioned one evening, not quite looking at me as she said it. We were in our apartment, and she was chopping vegetables for dinner, her movements a little too precise, a little too controlled. "She was talking to your aunt on the phone." I don't think she realized I understood enough Hindi to catch it. I felt my stomach tighten. Emily had been studying Hindi for almost a year by then, quietly, without making a show of it, because she wanted to understand my family without needing a translator standing between them. "I'm sorry," I said, because I did not know what else to say. Apologizing had become something of a reflex whenever my mother's behavior surfaced in our conversations. "You don't have to apologize for her," Emily said, setting down the knife. "I just want to know if this is going to get better, or if this is just how it's going to be." I told her it would get better. I believed it, or at least I wanted to believe it, the way a person wants to believe a wound will heal simply because enough time has passed. I did not yet understand that my mother's disapproval was not a wound that would close on its own. It was something she was actively keeping open, tending to it the way she tended to her small garden of curry leaves on the back porch, watering it with worry and expectation. The proposal happened in the spring, on a weekend trip to Door County, Wisconsin. I had planned it for months, choosing a quiet spot along the water where Emily had once told me she felt most at peace. When I got down on one knee, she cried before I even finished the sentence, and when she said yes, I felt something in my chest loosen that I had not realized was tight. Telling my parents was harder than the proposal itself. I drove to their house alone first, wanting to speak with them privately before Emily and I made any public announcement. My father congratulated me warmly, pulling me into a hug that lasted longer than his hugs usually did. My mother sat very still at the kitchen table, her hands folded in front of her, and said only, "I see." "Mom, I want your blessing," I said, sitting across from her. "I know this isn't what you imagined for me, but Emily makes me happy. She respects our family. She respects our culture." My mother looked at me for a long moment before speaking. "Respect is not the same as understanding, Rohan. She can learn our recipes. She can wear our clothes. But she did not grow up praying beside her mother at 5 in the morning. She did not grow up understanding what it costs to keep a culture alive in a country that wants to erase it. You are asking me to trust that with someone who has never had to fight for it." Her words stayed with me for days afterward, not because I agreed with them, but because I could hear the fear buried beneath them. My mother had spent nearly 30 years building a fortress around our traditions, brick by careful brick, and she seemed to believe that fortress could only be defended by someone who had helped lay its foundation. Despite her reservations, my mother did not forbid the wedding, and I took that as a kind of victory at the time, a naive one. She helped plan certain ceremonial elements, insisting that we include a full Hindu wedding ceremony, alongside the American one Emily's parents were organizing. I remember feeling relieved. thinking that her willingness to participate meant she was slowly coming around. Emily threw herself into learning the wedding rituals with genuine devotion. She met with my mother twice a week for nearly 2 months, learning the meaning behind the Mangal Sutra, the significance of the 7 vows we would take around the sacred fire, the proper way to wear a sari without it unraveling by the end of the ceremony. My mother taught her all of this with technical precision, but I noticed, whenever I observed these lessons, that warmth was almost entirely absent from her instruction. She was teaching Emily the way one teaches a stranger a set of rules, not the way one welcomes a daughter into a family. The wedding itself took place on a warm September afternoon, blending both traditions in a way that made my chest ache with pride. Emily walked around the fire in a red and gold lehenga, her hands henna'd with intricate patterns my cousin had spent 4 hours creating. My mother performed her ceremonial duties correctly, guiding Emily through each ritual, but I watched her eyes throughout the ceremony, and I never once saw them soften. At the reception, during the toasts, my mother stood and spoke briefly in Hindi, wishing us a prosperous life together, thanking our guests for coming. It was a beautiful, dignified speech, and everyone applauded warmly. Only I noticed that she never once said Emily's name. Later that night, lying beside my new wife in a hotel room decorated with leftover rose petals, Emily turned to me and asked quietly, "Do you think she'll ever really accept me?" I told her yes. I told her it would simply take time. I did not yet know how wrong I was, or how much that word time would come to mean something entirely different than patience. For my mother, time was not something that would soften her position. It was something she intended to use. The first year of marriage brought a kind of tension I had not anticipated, one that crept in slowly, rather than arriving all at once. My mother began calling me more frequently, always with some small concern dressed up as casual conversation. She would ask about my diet, worried that Emily was not cooking Indian food often enough. She would ask about religious observances, wanting to know if we had lit a diya for this festival or that one. Each phone call felt harmless in isolation, but together they formed a steady current pulling at my attention, reminding me constantly of a life she believed I was drifting away from. Emily noticed the pattern before I did. "Your mom called 3 times today," she mentioned one evening, setting my phone on the counter after I had missed the calls during a work meeting. "She left a message asking why we didn't attend the puja at the temple on Saturday. We had your cousin's birthday party," I said, feeling a familiar defensiveness rise in my chest. "I know. I just feel like everything we choose to do that isn't specifically Indian gets treated like abandonment," Emily said quietly. She was not accusing me of anything. She simply sounded tired, the particular tiredness that comes from trying very hard at something for a long time without seeing results. I began visiting my parents more often that year, partly out of guilt, and partly out of a genuine desire to preserve the closeness I had always shared with them. Emily came along most of the time, though I noticed she began finding small excuses to stay home occasionally, exhaustion masking itself as a headache or extra work deadlines. I did not push her on these excuses because, if I was honest with myself, I understood them. During one visit that spring, my mother pulled me aside into the kitchen while Emily sat in the living room with my father. "Rohan, I want to ask you something, and I want you to really think before you answer," she said, her voice low. "Do you think your children, when you have them, will know how to pray? Will they know their grandmother's language? Will they understand what it means to be Hindu, to be Indian, or will all of that end with you?" The question landed like a stone in my stomach. "Mom, Emily has already said she wants our kids raised with Indian traditions. She's been studying Hindi. You've seen this yourself. Studying is not the same as living it, Beta. I lived it. My mother lived it. It is in our blood, in our bones. She can memorize the words to an arty, but she will never feel it the way we do." My mother's eyes filled with something that looked almost like grief. "I am not trying to hurt you. I am trying to protect something precious before it disappears completely." I left that conversation shaken, though I did not share the full weight of it with Emily that night. I told myself I was protecting her from unnecessary pain, but looking back, I understand now that I was also protecting myself from having to confront how deeply my mother's words had unsettled me. The tension found new outlets over the following months. My mother started making comments during family gatherings that walked a careful line between concern and criticism. At my cousin's engagement party, she loudly praised the bride-to-be's ability to cook 17 different regional dishes, then turned to the table where Emily sat and asked with an innocent tilt of her head whether Emily had learned to make proper roti yet, or whether we were still ordering takeout. The room laughed, assuming it was harmless teasing. Emily laughed too, but I saw her knuckles whiten slightly around her water glass. Later in the car, she stayed quiet for several minutes before speaking. "I know she doesn't mean it as an attack every single time," she said, staring out the window. "But it adds up, Rohan. It adds up in a way that makes me feel like I'm constantly being measured against a standard I can never actually meet. Because the standard isn't really about cooking. It's about not being born Indian." I did not have a good response for her that night, because I knew she was right, and admitting that felt like betraying my mother in some way I could not fully articulate. My father remained largely silent through all of this, as he always had. I confronted him once, quietly, after my mother had made a particularly sharp comment about Emily's forgetfulness regarding a religious observance. "Dad, why don't you ever say anything when she talks to Emily like that?" He sighed, rubbing his forehead in the way he did when he was choosing his words carefully. "Your mother gave up everything to build the life we have here, Rohan. Her whole identity became about preserving what we left behind. I think, in her mind, if she lets go of this one thing, she is afraid everything else will unravel too. I do not agree with how she treats Emily, but I also do not know how to fight 30 years of fear with a single conversation." His honesty surprised me, though it offered little comfort. I understood, perhaps for the first time, that my father's silence was not indifference. It was exhaustion, the particular exhaustion of a man who had spent decades keeping peace in a household built on a foundation he had never fully agreed with. By the end of that first year, Emily and I had developed private routines to protect our marriage from the growing pressure, small rituals that belonged only to us, away from my mother's watchful concern. We started Sunday morning walks along the lake, just the two of us, deliberately leaving our phones at home. It was during one of these walks, in early autumn, that Emily told me she was pregnant. I felt an overwhelming joy in that moment, standing beside the water with her hands in mine. But beneath the joy, a quieter, more anxious thought had already begun to form, one I could not push away no matter how hard I tried. I wondered how my mother would react to the news, and whether this child, still unborn, was about to become the newest battlefield in a war I had never wanted to fight. I told my parents about the pregnancy on a Sunday evening in October, almost exactly 1 year after my father had spoken so honestly about my mother's fears. I had rehearsed the moment in my head for days, imagining warmth, imagining my mother's face softening the way it did in old photographs from before we left India, photographs where she looked younger and less burdened by everything she had chosen to carry. My father's reaction was immediate and joyful. He stood up from his chair, embraced me tightly, and then embraced Emily with a gentleness that brought tears to her eyes. My mother remained seated for a long moment before rising slowly and offering Emily a brief, careful hug. "Congratulations," she said. Then, turning to me, she added, "We must begin thinking about the naming ceremony properly. There are rules that must be followed exactly, Rohan. This is not something to be casual about." The months that followed became consumed by exactly this. Rules. My mother inserted herself into every decision surrounding the pregnancy with an intensity that left little room for anyone else's preferences, including Emily's. She insisted on selecting the priest for the naming ceremony without consulting us. She began suggesting names from an approved list of what she called proper Sanskrit names, dismissing outright any name that sounded even slightly Western, regardless of how much thought Emily and I had put into it. "What about Maya?" Emily suggested one evening, her hand resting on her growing belly. "It works in both cultures. It has meaning in Sanskrit, and it's easy for everyone to pronounce." When we mentioned this name to my mother during a phone call, she was quiet for a moment before saying, "Maya is acceptable, I suppose, though it sounds like the kind of name American children choose because they liked it in a movie. Why not something with real depth, like Anjali or Priyanka?" Emily, sitting beside me, heard the comment through the speakerphone and left the room without a word. I found her later in the nursery we had just begun painting, sitting on the floor with her back against the wall, tears streaming silently down her face. "I'm not trying to erase your culture, Rohan," she said. "I just want to have some say in naming my own child. Is that really so much to ask?" I felt caught, as I so often did during that period, suspended between two women I loved deeply, each of them certain of her own position, neither willing to yield entirely. I told Emily I understood, and I meant it, but I did not confront my mother directly that night, or for many nights after, because confrontation with her had always felt like pulling at a thread that might unravel something much larger than a single argument. The breaking point came 2 weeks before Emily's due date, during what should have been a peaceful baby shower organized by Emily's American friends and a few members of my extended family. My mother arrived late, and within the first hour, I noticed her engaged in a quiet but pointed conversation with my Aunt Kamala, both of them glancing occasionally toward Emily, who was laughing with her friends near the gift table, unaware of the scrutiny. Later, while Emily opened gifts, my mother approached me in the kitchen where I was refilling a tray of samosas. "Rohan, I need to say something to you, and I have held it inside for too long," she said, her voice tight with an emotion I had rarely heard from her, something between desperation and grief. "This baby will be the first grandchild in our family. If you do not insist on raising this child properly, with our language, our religion, our values, front and center, this entire branch of our family tree will disappear into America completely. Everything my parents and I sacrificed will have been for nothing." "Mom, that's not fair," I said, setting down the tray. "Emily has done everything to embrace our culture. She's studying Hindi. She wants a puja room in our house. What more do you want from her?" "I want you to remember who you are," my mother said, her voice rising slightly, drawing a few curious glances from nearby guests. "I want you to remember that you are not just American, Rohan. You are Indian first. That does not disappear because you fell in love with someone who was born here." The words hung in the air between us, sharper than anything she had said before. I felt something shift inside me in that moment, a quiet, cold clarity replacing the guilt I had carried for over a year. "Emily was also born here," I said slowly. "And so was I, practically. I have spent my entire life trying to honor where you came from, Mom. But I will not let you make my wife feel like a threat to something she has only ever tried to protect and love." My mother stared at me, stunned, as though I had struck her. She said nothing further, gathering her purse and leaving the party early without saying goodbye to Emily. I stood in the kitchen for several minutes afterward, my hands trembling slightly, aware that something fundamental had shifted between us, though I did not yet know how deep the fracture would become. 2 days later, Emily went into labor 3 days early. Throughout the 16 hours of delivery, my mother did not call once. She arrived at the hospital nearly 8 hours after our daughter was born, standing stiffly at the doorway of the hospital room, looking at the small bundle in Emily's arms with an expression I could not fully read. "Have you chosen a name?" she asked quietly. Emily looked at me, then at my mother, and answered with a steadiness I deeply admired. "Her name is Maya Savitri Bhatia," she said. "We wanted her middle name to honor you." My mother's composure broke for just a moment, her eyes glistening before she blinked the emotion away and straightened her shoulders. "That was not necessary," she said softly, though her voice trembled slightly as she said it, and she did not move closer to hold her granddaughter, turning instead toward the window, her back to both of us. I did not know, in that quiet, painful moment, whether we were witnessing the beginning of a thaw or simply another wall being built, brick by careful brick, the way she had built everything else in her life that she was afraid of losing. The weeks after Maya's birth passed in a haze of exhaustion and quiet hope. My mother visited occasionally, always polite, always helpful in practical ways, cooking meals and folding tiny onesies with the same precision she brought to everything. But she remained emotionally distant from Emily, speaking to her only when necessary, directing most of her attention and affection toward Maya alone. I watched Emily absorb this treatment with a patience that both amazed and worried me, and I began to understand that patience, however admirable, has limits that eventually get tested. The real turning point came 4 months after Maya was born, during a conversation I overheard by accident. I had come home early from work, walking quietly into the house because Maya was napping, and I heard my mother's voice coming from the nursery, where she believed she was alone with her granddaughter. She was speaking softly in Hindi, singing a lullaby I remembered from my own childhood, one my grandmother had taught her decades earlier in a different country entirely. "You will know where you come from," she whispered to Maya, her voice thick with an emotion I had rarely witnessed. "I will make sure of it, even if your mother does not understand what she carries away from you simply by being who she is." I stood frozen in the hallway, my chest tight, torn between anger and a strange, aching sympathy. I understood, perhaps more clearly than ever before, that my mother's behavior was never really about Emily specifically. It was about fear, an old, deep fear of disappearing entirely into a country that had asked her to leave so much of herself behind already. But understanding her fear did not excuse the damage it was causing, and I knew, standing in that hallway, that something had to change decisively. That evening, after Emily put Maya to bed, I sat my parents down at their kitchen table for a conversation I had been avoiding for nearly 2 years. "Mom, Dad, I need you to really hear me," I began, my voice steadier than I expected. "I love you both, and I am grateful for everything you sacrificed to give me this life. But I cannot continue watching you treat my wife as an obstacle to our culture, instead of someone who has spent years trying to become part of it." My mother started to protest, but I continued gently, refusing to let the conversation slip into its usual pattern of guilt and avoidance. "Emily has learned our language, our recipes, our prayers. She named our daughter after you, Mom, not because she had to, but because she wanted to honor you. If our culture disappears from this family, it will not be because of her. It will be because we chose not to share it with love, and instead tried to use it as a wall to keep her out." The silence that followed stretched long enough that I began to wonder if I had said too much. Then, unexpectedly, my father spoke, his voice quiet but firm in a way I had rarely heard from him. "He is right, Savitri. I have stayed silent for 2 years because I did not want conflict in this house. But my silence has cost us more than any argument would have. Emily deserves better from us. Our son deserves better from us." My mother's eyes filled with tears, and for the first time since I had introduced Emily to her, she did not try to hide them or blink them away quickly. "I was so afraid," she said softly, almost to herself. "I was afraid that if I let go, everything I built here would simply vanish, like it never mattered at all. I did not know how to separate protecting our culture from protecting my fear of losing you." I reached across the table and took her hand, something I had not done in longer than I could remember. "You do not have to choose between us, Mom. Emily is not trying to take me away from being Indian. She is trying to help me become the version of myself who can hold both worlds honestly, the way you always taught me to, before fear got in the way." The change that followed was not immediate or dramatic, but it was real. My mother began calling Emily directly, without going through me first, asking small, genuine questions about her day. She invited Emily to help prepare food for the next Diwali celebration, not as a test this time, but as an actual invitation to participate. The first time my mother laughed at something Emily said, a real, unguarded laugh during a family dinner months later, I felt something in my chest loosen that had been tight for nearly 3 years. On Maya's first birthday, we held her celebration combining both traditions, exactly as we had done at our wedding. My mother performed the small religious ceremony with the same careful precision she brought to everything, but this time, when it came time to bless Maya, she reached out and included Emily's hand alongside her own over our daughter's head, a small gesture that meant more to me than any words could have. Later that evening, as guests began leaving, I found my mother and Emily sitting together on the porch, looking through an old photo album from Jaipur, my mother pointing out relatives Emily had never met, explaining stories behind faded photographs, with a warmth I had not heard in her voice in years. Emily was listening intently, occasionally asking questions in careful, practiced Hindi, and my mother was answering patiently, correcting her pronunciation gently, the way a mother corrects a child she has decided, finally, to claim as her own. I stood in the doorway, watching them, holding Maya against my shoulder, and I understood that forgiveness had not arrived all at once, the way I had once hoped it would. It had arrived slowly, through difficult conversations, through small gestures repeated over time, through my father finally finding his voice, and through my own refusal to let fear dictate the shape of my family any longer. We had not lost our culture by choosing love. We had simply learned finally how to carry it together.